Welcome to Books in 10. Remember, we're raffling an iPhone once we hit 10,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and explore Orwell's impactful journey with us. Today we're taking a deep dive into George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier.
Fascinating choice.
It's a really powerful look at the social and economic realities of England in the 1930s.
Right. A time of immense hardship for many.
Yeah, Orwell really immerses you in the world he's describing through these incredibly vivid details, like he doesn't just tell you about poverty, he makes you feel it.
That's Orwell's strength for sure. His
Yeah.
honesty, his ability to capture those everyday struggles.
Exactly, and it's really striking. So we have excerpts from the book itself, and one of the things that really stuck with me was his description of the Brooker's lodging house.
Ah, yes. A very powerful example of the living conditions many faced.
Imagine, just picture this, like sharing a single room with multiple families, the only toilet being a chamber pot that everyone uses.
It's almost unimaginable, isn't it?
It is. And Orwell doesn't shy away from the details.
Right.
Like, he describes the smell, the grime, Mr. Brooker, with his perpetually dirty hands handling the food.
It goes beyond just the physical discomfort, though. It's that sense of stagnation, of hopelessness that you can almost feel seeping through the pages.
Yeah, and it's not just a lodging house. It's like he talks about this family eating reheated frozen tripe day after day.
Because it was all they could afford.
Exactly. It's these really specific details that make it so real, so visceral. And it really makes you think, like, how did progress, which was supposed to improve lives,
Yeah.
how did it lead to such dismal conditions for so many?
That's a question that continues to haunt us, doesn't it? How can progress and poverty coexist? It's something that Orwell explores further, especially when he goes down into those coal mines.
Oh, his writing is so powerful there. You can almost feel the claustrophobia of the cage ride, the deafening noise of the conveyor belt,
Right, and that heat.
that oppressive heat and dust.
You really get a sense of the sensory experience, the sheer physicality of it all.
It's not just about the work at the coalface either. Orwell talks about the traveling time, the hours spent crawling to and from their work area.
Yeah, and that wasn't even considered part of their paid work. It was just expected.
Yeah, unbelievable. And then he describes the miners themselves as hammered iron statues, figures of strength and endurance, despite the grueling work and the meager meals they subsisted on.
It really challenges those stereotypes of miners as being rough or unintelligent.
Yeah, absolutely. It really makes you think about the unseen costs of those things we take for granted.
The human toll behind the fuel that powered the nation.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, if we acknowledge how hard certain jobs are, does that change our responsibility towards the people who do them?
That's a tough question. Do we just accept it as a necessary evil? Or do we have a moral obligation to do better by them?
It's something worth pondering, for sure. And it actually leads us to another big issue that Orwell tackles, the housing crisis. He describes this stark contrast.
Oh, yeah. He talks about all those empty houses, the ones meant for the wealthy, sitting there while so many lacked decent shelter.
And it's not just the lack of housing, it's the quality. Overcrowding, leaking roofs, unsanitary conditions, these were all too common.
He mentions one house where the sewer actually ran right beneath it.
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah, imagine that in the summer months.
And remember, these houses had no hot water. Can you imagine?
Coming home every day, covered in coal dust, no way to really wash yourself properly.
It's really about basic dignity, isn't it? Orwell talks about how these living conditions erode self-respect. How can you maintain any semblance of normal life in such circumstances?
Right. It's that vicious cycle, isn't it? Poverty leads to substandard housing, which in turn makes it even harder to escape poverty.
Absolutely. And even with those attempts to improve things, like the corporation houses, those government-provided options, well, they weren't perfect either.
No. Orwell notes that they often came at a higher cost.
Yeah, both financially and emotionally. Some residents actually preferred their old slums, despite all the squalor.
Because it was familiar, at least. It was home.
Right. It just shows that even with good intentions, those solutions can have unforeseen consequences. We have to consider the human element, the individual experiences, in any sort of social reform effort.
Absolutely.
So from the mines to those housing conditions, Orwell paints a pretty bleak picture of working class life in those times.
It's stark and unflinching. But he wasn't just presenting problems.
He wanted action, right?
Exactly. He wanted people to see, to understand, to be moved to make things better.
It's easy to read about these things in a history book, but Orwell makes you feel it.
It's an experience that sticks with you.
Definitely. And that leads us to another crucial aspect: the harsh realities of unemployment and what it meant to live on the dole in 1930s England.
Yes, and the myth that those 2 million unemployed people represented the whole picture.
Right, the impact went much, much deeper, but we'll delve into that in our next segment.
It's easy to get caught up in those numbers, but we have to remember, like you said, those official figures didn't tell the whole story.
Right, those figures only counted those who were actually receiving the dole, the heads of families.
But to really understand the impact of unemployment, you have to think about all the people who depended on those meager payments.
All those dependents who weren't officially counted.
Exactly. Like, imagine a man standing in line for the dole, okay, but behind him is his wife and their 3 children, all relying on that single payment.
So essentially, you're talking about a much larger population affected by unemployment than those official figures suggest.
Precisely. And Orwell even suggests multiplying those figures by a factor of 3 to get a more accurate picture.
Wow, and then you have to consider those who were technically employed, but were still living in poverty because their wages were so low.
The working poor.
Yeah, they weren't eligible for the dole, but they were still struggling to survive.
Absolutely. And when you factor in all these individuals and families, you start to grasp the true scale of the problem.
Orwell cites Sir John Orr, who estimated that there were around 20 million people in Britain living in poverty at the time.
A staggering figure.
It's hard to comprehend the impact of such widespread deprivation.
And to illustrate this, Orwell uses the town of Wigan, where he spent a lot of time as a kind of microcosm.
Yeah, Wigan was hit particularly hard by unemployment, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Over a third of the town's population was relying on the dole, with thousands of miners facing long-term unemployment.
And Orwell really delves into the specifics of the dole system, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about the different levels of assistance, the dole itself, then transitional benefit, and then public assistance.
And each one barely providing enough to get by.
Right. He gives examples of families struggling to make ends meet, having to make impossible choices between food, rent, and other necessities.
It's heartbreaking to imagine.
And then there was the means test, which was used to determine eligibility for assistance.
It wasn't just a simple form, though, was it?
No, not at all. Inspectors would visit your home unannounced to make sure you weren't hiding any income or assets.
So people were constantly living in fear of losing those benefits.
Exactly. It must have been incredibly dehumanizing.
This constant scrutiny, the fear of losing what little you had.
And it really challenges that stereotype of the unemployed as being lazy or unwilling to work.
It's important to remember that context.
Orwell points out that the shame associated with unemployment had actually started to fade by this point.
Because it becomes so widespread.
Exactly. It was a consequence of years of hardship, this kind of normalization of the dole.
People began to see it as a fact of life rather than a personal failing.
Right. But that acceptance came at a cost.
Orwell describes this frightful feeling of impotence and despair that many experienced.
This sense of being trapped with no way out.
He writes that this feeling was far worse than any hardship.
It really highlights the psychological toll of long-term unemployment.
The impact on people's sense of self-worth, their hope for the future.
And it makes you wonder, how does prolonged economic hardship reshape the mindset and expectations of an entire generation?
What happens when work, which is often seen as the very thing that defines your value in society, is no longer an option?
Profound questions, and Orwell doesn't stop there. He also delves into the social and cultural dimensions of unemployment, particularly how it impacted gender roles and family dynamics.
That's a fascinating aspect as well.
He observed that despite being unemployed, men still clung to their roles as heads of households.
Even though they couldn't provide financially.
Exactly. It seems paradoxical, but it speaks volumes about those deeply ingrained gender norms of the time.
Doing housework was seen as emasculating a threat to a man's identity.
So they were caught in this impossible situation, unable to fulfill their traditional roles, yet unwilling to step outside of them.
And of course, this placed an even heavier burden on women.
They had to manage the household with even less money, and often had to take on extra work just to make ends meet.
It's a testament to their strength and resilience in the face of such adversity.
It really underscores how hardship is often unevenly distributed even within families and communities.
Unemployment might have been a shared experience, but its impact varied greatly.
Now, Orwell also explores those initiatives aimed at addressing unemployment.
Right, like allotments where people could grow their own food.
And occupational centers that offer training in various trades.
But he's quite critical of these efforts, isn't he?
He found them inadequate and often patronizing,
I remember him describing the YMCA atmosphere of the occupational centers.
where the focus seemed to be on moral improvement rather than practical skills.
It highlights that tension between charity and empowerment, doesn't it?
Was the goal to keep the unemployed occupied and pacified, or to give them the tools they needed to regain their independence?
Orwell clearly believed in the latter,
He admired the work of the National Unemployed Workers Movement.
the NUWM.
Yes. He praised their commitment to collective action and their efforts to empower the unemployed to advocate for themselves.
And he championed those more practical solutions as well, like providing every unemployed person with a plot of land and tools for growing food.
He understood the need for both immediate relief and long-term empowerment.
Which brings us back to Orwell's core message, the need for a more just and equitable society.
A society that values all its members regardless of their employment status.
And that leads us to his exploration of the political landscape
Yeah.
and the role of socialism in addressing these issues.
But before we dive into his political analysis, let's take a moment to really reflect on the complexities of unemployment that we've just discussed.
Those personal stories, the systemic challenges, the struggle for dignity in the face of such adversity, these are issues that continue to resonate with us today.
It's a reminder that even though Orwell was writing about a specific time and place, his observations about poverty, inequality, and the human condition remain relevant and thought-provoking.
It really is amazing how his work still speaks to us all these years later. But as you said, he doesn't just point out the problems, he grapples with potential solutions. And that includes his views on socialism.
And his perspective on socialism is fascinating because it's not just a simple endorsement.
Right, he's critical of the existing system, of course, but he's also critical of some of those proposed solutions.
He really challenges those traditional notions of class. He argues that it's not just about income.
There's more to it than that.
Right. It's about those ingrained manners, that social status, those deep-seated prejudices that are hard to overcome.
He's really critical of what he calls proletarian cant. That kind of rhetoric that can alienate potential allies.
He felt that a lot of socialist messaging wasn't resonating with the broader population because it focused too narrowly on this kind of idealized image of the working class.
It's like he was speaking to a very specific audience and ignoring the complexities of class and the struggles of other groups.
Including the squeezed middle class, as he put it.
He believed that a more inclusive and pragmatic approach was needed, one that focused on common goals rather than divisive rhetoric.
Finding that common ground, that shared humanity that can bridge the divides between us.
And he makes a really interesting point about propaganda. He says that effective propaganda should appeal to those shared interests like justice, liberty, the plight of the unemployed.
Rather than just reinforcing those existing divisions.
Exactly. He felt that focusing on those universal values would be more likely to unite people across class lines.
And create a more powerful movement for change.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together in a way.
We all want a better world.
And he also emphasizes the importance of recognizing the diversity within the working class itself.
He points out that not every worker fits that stereotype of the hard-drinking, brawling brute.
He met many working class people who were thoughtful, intelligent, capable of really nuanced political thought.
It's a reminder that we should be careful about stereotyping entire groups of people.
There's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And then there's his critique of some socialist intellectuals.
He questions their motives a bit, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests that sometimes their desire for revolution stemmed more from a sense of order than genuine empathy for the working class.
Like they were looking down on the masses rather than truly understanding their struggles.
He argues that true socialism should be a movement driven by the people, not dictated by intellectuals.
A bottom-up approach.
Exactly. And he also critiques the often puritanical nature of socialist discourse.
It's interesting how he ties that back to his observations about the diets of the unemployed.
He points out that people living in poverty often spent their limited money on tasty treats rather than those nutritious but bland foods.
He acknowledges that it might not be the most rational choice, but it's a human one.
When you're constantly struggling, you need those small moments of pleasure to make life bearable.
And Orwell understood that.
He felt that this kind of joyless vision of the future lacked appeal and failed to inspire people to fight for a better world.
So after taking this journey with Orwell, what are we left with? What's the lasting message of The Road to Wigan Pier?
Well, he doesn't offer any easy answers or simple solutions. He's not giving us a roadmap to utopia.
He's painting a picture of reality.
Exactly. He's presenting a nuanced and sometimes uncomfortable look at the complexities of poverty, class, and social change.
He wants us to confront our own assumptions and prejudices.
To really consider the human cost of inequality.
It's a call for empathy and action.
A reminder that building a more just society requires understanding compassion and a willingness to bridge those divides that separate us,
It's about recognizing our shared humanity.
and working together towards a better future.
Orwell's book is a journey worth taking, and its lessons extend far beyond the specific time and place in which it was written. We encourage you to explore his work and see what insights you can uncover.
The Road to Wigan Pier offers a powerful glimpse into the human condition, and its message continues to resonate today.
It's a reminder that the fight for justice and equality is an ongoing one, and that each of us has a role to play in creating a better world. And that wraps up our deep dive into The Road to Wigan Pier. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of powerful and thought-provoking books. And don't forget about our iPhone raffle. We're getting closer to that 10,000 subscriber goal. So spread the word and join us next time for another deep dive into the world of literature,